The morning of September 19th, 2020, broke quiet over the rolling hills of Westchester County, New York. Autumn had begun its slow approach, and the trees surrounding the village of Purchase held the last weight of summer green. Along Anderson Hill Road, where wealth had long ago learned to conceal itself behind stone walls and private drives, the estate once belonging to Donald McIntosh. Kendall stood in perfect stillness. Inside, at some hour that would never be publicly specified, the man who had served as chief executive of PepsiCo for 15 years and as chairman for another decade beyond that, had drawn his final breath. He was 99 years old. The obituaries would describe him as a titan of American business, a Cold War statesman of the corporate world, a man who had opened doors that governments could not. They would mention his friendship with Richard Nixon, his legendary encounter with Nikita Khrushchev, his transformation of a soft drink company into a global force. They would not dwell on the quieter dimensions of his influence, the private meetings held far from boardrooms, the estates that served purposes beyond residence, the relationships that bridged ideology when diplomacy had publicly failed. The house in Purchase was not his only property. There had been holdings in North Carolina as well, retreats suited to a man who understood that true power often required distance from its visible exercise. These were not merely homes. They were stages, carefully maintained, where conversations could unfold without record, where handshakes carried weight that contracts could not capture. Donald Kendall had entered the American business world in 1947, a young man recently returned from naval service in the Pacific. He joined Pepsi-Cola as a fountain syrup salesman in New Rochelle, working routes that took him through the suburban sprawl just north of New York City. The work was modest. The ambition was not. Within 12 years, he had risen to the position of president of Pepsi-Cola International, overseeing the company's expansion into markets that American commerce had barely touched. His ascent was noted for its velocity, though the precise mechanisms of that rise, the alliances formed, the rivals outmaneuvered, remained largely unexamined in the official accounts. It was in Moscow, in the summer of 1959, that Donald Kendall stepped onto a stage far larger than any corporate promotion could have arranged. The American National Exhibition had opened at Sokolniki Park, a showcase of consumer goods intended to demonstrate the material prosperity of capitalist life. Vice President Richard Nixon was present. So was Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And so, in a role that was neither accidental nor entirely planned, was Donald Kendall standing beside a Pepsi booth with cups of cola in hand. What followed would be remembered as the kitchen debate, a tense, improvised exchange between Nixon and Khrushchev amid model American kitchens and color televisions. But within that spectacle, a smaller moment occurred. Kendall, seizing an opportunity that he would later describe with studied modesty, offered Khrushchev a cup of Pepsi. The Soviet leader drank. Photographers captured the image. And in that single gesture, a soft drink became something else entirely. A symbol, a tool, a point of entry into a closed world. The official narrative presented this as a triumph of American enterprise, a businessman's instinct rewarded by global exposure. The photograph circulated widely. Kendall's reputation grew. But the story, as it was told in boardrooms and business schools, omitted the texture of what had actually transpired, the prior coordination, the political calculations, the understanding that commerce and statecraft had become, in certain hands, indistinguishable. Richard Nixon lost his presidential bid in 1960. He would spend the next 8 years in a kind of exile, practicing law, cultivating connections, waiting. Donald Kendall remained close throughout. Their friendship, forged in Moscow and sustained through political defeat, would prove consequential in ways that extended far beyond campaign contributions or corporate endorsements. When Nixon finally entered the White House in 1969, Kendall was among those who understood best what doors might now open and what could be carried through them. The estates in Purchase and North Carolina stood ready. The Cold War continued, and the man who had handed Nikita Khrushchev a paper cup of cola was about to become something more than a beverage executive. The village of Purchase, New York, takes its name from a colonial-era land transaction, a purchase made in 1696 from the Siwanoy people, recorded in documents that have long since yellowed into obscurity. By the 20th century, the area had evolved into something else entirely, a landscape of deliberate seclusion, where corporate chieftains and old money families constructed estates designed to project permanence while sheltering privacy. It was here, along roads that bore no signage and led to gates that offered no welcome, that Donald Kendall would establish his primary residence during the years of his greatest influence. The house itself was substantial without being ostentatious, a calculation that reflected its owner's understanding of how power preferred to present itself. Stone and timber, set back from the road, surrounded by grounds that suggested inherited wealth even when the fortune was newly made. Kendall had not been born to this world. His origins lay in the dairy farms of Washington State, in a childhood shaped by the particular austerity of the American West during the Depression years. But he had studied the manners of the class he intended to join, and he reproduced them with precision. Inside these walls, during the late 1960s and throughout the 70s, a different kind of diplomacy unfolded. The formal channels of Soviet-American relations remained frozen in mutual suspicion, governed by arms negotiations and public posturing. But commerce offered alternative pathways, and Donald Kendall, now chief executive of PepsiCo, possessed both the connections and the temperament to walk them. His elevation to the top position at PepsiCo in 1971 had not been inevitable. The company's board included figures of considerable independent power, and the selection process had involved maneuvering that left certain rivals embittered. Alfred Steele, a previous chief executive, had transformed the company's image through marketing and celebrity. His marriage to Joan Crawford had made Pepsi a fixture of Hollywood. But Steele had died suddenly in 1959, and the company had since struggled to define its identity against the overwhelming dominance of Coca-Cola. Kendall offered a different vision, not glamour, but reach, not celebrity, but access to rooms that competitors could not enter. The relationship with Richard Nixon proved central to this strategy. When Nixon assumed the presidency, Kendall gained something more valuable than any government contract. He gained proximity to decisions that would shape the global economic order. The two men spoke frequently. They dined together. They shared an understanding of how the world actually functioned, beneath the rhetoric of ideology and the performance of democratic process. In 1972, this understanding produced a result that the business press would describe as extraordinary. PepsiCo signed an agreement with the Soviet Union to become the first American consumer product sold within that closed market. In exchange, Pepsi would receive exclusive rights to distribute Stolichnaya vodka in the United States. The deal was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was also, in its structure and its implications, something far more complex than a simple commercial transaction. The negotiations had not taken place in government offices or corporate boardrooms alone. They had unfolded in private settings, at the estate in Purchase, at gatherings where Soviet trade officials mingled with American executives, where interpreters translated not merely language but intention. Kendall understood that the Soviets valued discretion above all, that deals of this magnitude required the appearance of mutual benefit and the reality of careful orchestration. He provided both. What Coca-Cola's leadership thought of this arrangement was never publicly articulated in full. The rivalry between the two companies had long since transcended market share and advertising campaigns. It had become a matter of identity, of national symbolism, of which vision of American capitalism would project itself onto the world stage. Coca-Cola had wrapped itself in patriotism, in military contracts, in the imagery of American soldiers drinking Coke from Atlanta to Okinawa. Kendall had chosen a different path, one that treated ideology as obstacle rather than foundation, that saw in the Cold War not a moral confrontation, but a series of doors waiting to be opened by those with the right keys. The estate in purchase became, during these years, a site of quiet consequence. Visitors arrived and departed without notice in the local press. Conversations occurred that left no memoranda. The grounds were maintained to a standard that suggested permanence, though the arrangements made within those walls were often provisional, contingent, subject to forces that no single executive could fully control. There were other properties as well. In North Carolina, Kendall maintained holdings that served different purposes, retreats suited to longer stays, to the kind of extended hospitality that certain negotiations required. The details of these properties, their precise locations and configurations, remained largely absent from the profiles and interviews that documented his public career. This absence was not accidental. A man who had learned to operate in the space between commerce and statecraft understood that visibility was a resource to be managed, not a condition to be accepted. The Pepsi-Stolichnaya arrangement announced in 1972 represented only the visible portion of a longer negotiation. Behind the press releases and the handshakes captured for cameras, a more intricate structure had been assembled, one that would expand over the following years into territory that no American corporation had previously occupied. By 1974, PepsiCo had begun construction on a bottling facility in Novorossiysk, a port city on the Black Sea. Soviet workers would operate Soviet machinery to produce an American soft drink for Soviet consumers. The symbolism was potent, though carefully managed to avoid triumphalism on either side. Kendall understood that the arrangement served purposes beyond profit. It provided the Soviet leadership with evidence that engagement with the West could proceed on terms they controlled. It provided the Nixon administration with a channel of economic interdependence that might, in theory, moderate political hostility. And it provided PepsiCo with exclusive access to a market of 250 million people. The timing of these developments intersected with upheavals that Kendall could not have anticipated. In August of 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. His administration collapsed under the weight of Watergate. The man who had provided Kendall's most valuable political connection was suddenly a pariah, retreating to his estate in San Clemente, abandoned by allies who had once sought his favor. Kendall did not abandon him. In the months and years that followed Nixon's disgrace, he remained a visible presence in the former president's diminished circle, attending dinners, maintaining the friendship, demonstrating a loyalty that others found either admirable or inexplicable, depending on their own positions. This constancy revealed something about Kendall's understanding of how relationships functioned at the highest levels of power. Nixon might be disgraced, but he was not without value. He retained connections, knowledge, the residue of decades spent accumulating leverage. He could still make introductions that others could not. He could still open doors in foreign capitals where his name carried weight despite, or perhaps because of, his downfall. Kendall recognized that disgrace was often temporary, that the networks built during power's exercise did not dissolve simply because the public had rendered judgment. Within PepsiCo itself, Kendall's authority during these years approached something close to absolute. The company had restructured under his leadership, diversifying beyond beverages into snack foods, restaurants, and sporting goods. The acquisition of Frito-Lay in 1965 had created a conglomerate capable of competing on multiple fronts simultaneously. But this expansion also created internal complexities, divisions that operated with varying degrees of autonomy, executives who cultivated their own ambitions, tensions between those who had risen with Kendall and those who had been absorbed through acquisition. The purchase estate served, in this context, as more than a residence. It functioned as a court, a place where favor could be granted or withdrawn, where the chairman's preferences became apparent through invitation or exclusion. Those who were summoned understood the significance. Those who were not summoned understood it equally well. Kendall governed through a combination of personal magnetism and carefully maintained distance, projecting accessibility while preserving the mystery that authority requires. His management style attracted both admiration and criticism, though the criticism tended to emerge only after departures, when former executives felt free to speak. Some described him as visionary, capable of seeing opportunities that others missed. Others used different language: autocratic, demanding, unforgiving of failure. The truth likely encompassed both characterizations. Building a global corporation during the Cold War required a particular kind of will, a comfort with decisions that could not be explained or justified to those outside the room where they were made. The North Carolina properties offered retreat from these pressures. The precise nature of these holdings remained somewhat obscured in public records, but their function was understood by those who knew Kendall well. Here, away from the metropolitan intensity of New York, a different rhythm prevailed. Hunting, golf, the rituals of Southern hospitality transplanted to serve Northern purposes. Guests who visited these properties found themselves in an environment calibrated to produce relaxation, candor, the dissolution of professional boundaries that formal settings maintained. Whether Soviet officials ever visited these southern retreats remained unconfirmed in any public account. The logistics would have been complex: security concerns, State Department protocols, the ever-present attention of intelligence services on both sides. But the absence of confirmation was not the same as denial. Kendall had demonstrated repeatedly that he could arrange what others assumed impossible. The channels he maintained operated precisely because they avoided the visibility that official contact required. The 1980s arrived with a shift in the geopolitical atmosphere that required recalibration. Ronald Reagan entered the White House, speaking of the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and the détente that had characterized the previous decade gave way to renewed confrontation. Military budgets expanded. Arms negotiations stalled. The language of Cold War absolutism, which Kendall had spent years working around, returned to dominance in Washington. Yet the Pepsi operations within the Soviet Union continued. The bottling plants kept producing. The trade in Stolichnaya vodka persisted. Whatever ideological winds blew through the capital, the commercial arrangements that Kendall had constructed proved remarkably durable. This durability owed something to the institutional momentum that large-scale trade agreements acquire, but it owed more to the relationships that Kendall had cultivated, independent of any single administration. He had built connections not merely to governments, but to individuals within governments, trade ministers, industrial planners, figures whose positions survived changes in political leadership because their expertise remained necessary. In 1983, Kendall transitioned from chief executive to chairman, ceding daily operational control, while retaining the authority that mattered most. The distinction was significant within corporate governance, but largely invisible to the outside world. He remained the face of PepsiCo's international ambitions, the figure who appeared in photographs beside Soviet officials, the man whose name opened doors that his successors could not have approached alone. The estate in purchase continued to function as it always had, as headquarters for a kind of diplomacy that existed parallel to the company's formal operations. His successor as chief executive, Wayne Calloway, had risen through the Frito-Lay division, bringing expertise in domestic consumer products rather than international negotiation. The arrangement suited Kendall's purposes. Calloway would manage the machinery of the corporation, while Kendall preserved the relationships that had made the machinery valuable. It was a division of labor that reflected Kendall's understanding of his own particular talents, not administration, but access, not management, but the cultivation of trust across boundaries that others considered impermeable. The private dimensions of Kendall's life during these years remained carefully separated from his public identity. He had married twice. His first marriage to Anne MacDonald had produced children and provided entry into Catholic social networks of considerable influence in the Northeast. The MacDonald family maintained connections to banking, to political dynasties, to the interlocking world of old money and new ambition that characterized mid-century American power. When that marriage ended in divorce, the proceedings remained discreet, the terms undisclosed, the social fabric carefully preserved despite the rupture. His second marriage to Bim Swarup brought a different set of associations. She was a woman of accomplishment in her own right, connected to international circles that complemented her husband's professional networks. Together, they presided over the purchase estate and its social functions with a discipline that guests noted and respected. Invitations were considered carefully. Guest lists reflected strategic calculation as much as personal affection. The household operated as an extension of Kendall's professional identity, a space where the boundaries between private life and corporate purpose had been deliberately dissolved. The North Carolina properties served different functions within this architecture. They offered respite from the intensity of the New York social calendar, a place where Kendall could engage in the pursuits that wealthy men of his generation considered appropriate: hunting, fishing, the cultivation of rural land as both investment and retreat. But even here, the separation between private and professional remained incomplete. Guests who joined him for these excursions often held positions of relevance to PepsiCo's interests. Conversations that occurred during morning hunts or evening dinners carried implications that extended beyond the immediate setting. What Kendall believed about the ideological conflict that defined his era remained difficult to determine from his public statements. He spoke of commerce as a bridge, of trade as a force for peace, of the mutual benefits that economic engagement could provide. But whether these sentiments reflected genuine conviction or strategic positioning was never entirely clear. He moved between worlds that proclaimed themselves irreconcilable, maintaining relationships with figures on both sides of the divide, treating the Cold War less as a moral struggle than as a landscape to be navigated by those with sufficient skill and nerve. The transformation that swept through the Soviet Union after 1985 created opportunities that even Kendall, with all his experience navigating that closed world, could not have fully anticipated. Mikhail Gorbachev's ascension to leadership brought new vocabulary into the lexicon of East-West relations: glasnost, perestroika, words that suggested an opening where previous decades had offered only walls. The commercial arrangements that Kendall had pioneered suddenly seemed not merely profitable, but prophetic, evidence that engagement, rather than confrontation, had been the wiser path all along. PepsiCo moved quickly to expand its Soviet presence. The original bottling plants had demonstrated that American consumer products could function within the socialist economy without destabilizing it. Now, with reforms accelerating and Soviet consumers increasingly aware of Western goods, the appetite for expansion grew on both sides. Kendall, though no longer chief executive, remained the essential intermediary. His relationships with Soviet officials had deepened over 15 years of sustained contact. He understood protocols, sensitivities, the particular ways that negotiations within that system required patience and indirection. In 1989, the arrangement between PepsiCo and the Soviet government produced a result that the business press treated as extraordinary, even fantastical. Faced with a currency that held no value in international markets, the Soviets proposed payment in kind. They would provide ships, specifically a fleet of submarines and surface vessels from their naval inventory. PepsiCo would accept these vessels and sell them for scrap to a Norwegian company, converting military hardware into dollars that could then finance continued soft drink production. The deal was valued at $3 billion, the largest commercial agreement between an American company and the Soviet Union in history. The symbolism was irresistible to commentators. A soft drink company had acquired a navy. The Cold War was dissolving into commerce, its weapon systems literally being melted down to finance the production of carbonated beverages. Kendall himself joked that PepsiCo had become, momentarily, the sixth largest naval power in the world. But beneath the humor lay a transaction of genuine complexity, logistical, legal, diplomatic, that required months of negotiation and the kind of trust that could not be manufactured for a single deal. It required history. It required the relationships that Kendall had spent decades building. The purchase estate during these years became a site of something approaching celebration within PepsiCo's executive circles. The company had achieved what Coca-Cola, for all its resources, had not: a position of dominance in a market that was about to open entirely. When the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, when the Soviet Union itself dissolved 2 years later, PepsiCo stood ready to expand into territories that had been inaccessible for 3 generations. Kendall had wagered on engagement when the conventional wisdom demanded confrontation, and events had vindicated the wager. Yet the vindication proved more complicated than the initial triumph suggested. The Soviet Union's collapse did not produce the orderly transition to market economics that Western advisors had anticipated. Instead, it unleashed chaos, hyperinflation, the collapse of state institutions, the rise of oligarchs who accumulated former state assets through means that bore little resemblance to the capitalism described in American business schools. The relationships that Kendall had cultivated with Soviet officials became suddenly less valuable. Those officials were gone, replaced by new figures operating according to rules that were still being written. Coca-Cola, meanwhile, had not been idle. The company that Kendall had outmaneuvered in the Soviet market moved aggressively into the post-Soviet space, deploying resources that dwarfed what PepsiCo could match. By the mid-1990s, the early advantage that Kendall's diplomacy had secured was eroding. The Russian market remained contested, its ultimate disposition unclear. The clear victory that had seemed assured in 1989 had become something more ambiguous, a foothold rather than a conquest, a position that required constant defense rather than confident expansion. Kendall observed these developments from an increasing distance. He had stepped down as chairman in 1986, retaining an emeritus role that provided office space and staff, but no operational authority. The company he had built continued to invoke his legacy, but the decisions that shaped its future were now made by others. The estate in purchase remained his, as did the properties in North Carolina, but the streams of visitors who had once sought his counsel diminished as the years passed. The death of Richard Nixon in April of 1994 severed one of the most consequential relationships of Kendall's life. The two men had known each other for 35 years, their fortunes intertwined through Moscow kitchens and White House dinners, through political triumph and disgrace, and the long, slow rehabilitation that followed. Kendall had remained loyal when others had not, visiting San Clemente and later Saddle River, maintaining a friendship that had outlasted its strategic utility. Whatever calculations had originally governed the relationship, time had transformed it into something that resembled genuine affection, or at least the mutual respect of men who had witnessed each other's full range of capability. Nixon's funeral drew the surviving members of a generation that had shaped the Cold War's middle decades. Presidents and secretaries of state gathered at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, offering eulogies that attempted to balance acknowledgement of achievement against the shadow that Watergate had permanently cast. Kendall attended, his presence noted by those who remembered the long association. He was 80 years old, still vigorous by the standards of his contemporaries, but increasingly a figure from an era that was passing into history. The 1990s demanded a different kind of corporate leadership than Kendall had embodied. The global economy that emerged after the Cold War operated according to logics that his generation had not anticipated. The instantaneous movement of capital across borders, the rise of technology companies that accumulated value without manufacturing physical products, the transformation of China, rather than Russia, into the essential market for Western ambitions. PepsiCo adapted to these conditions under new leadership, pursuing acquisitions and divestitures that reflected contemporary financial theory rather than the patient relationship building that had characterized Kendall's approach. He watched these changes with whatever private assessments he maintained. Public comments from this period were rare and carefully measured. He had never been given to extensive self-reflection in interviews, preferring to project confidence rather than introspection. The skills that had served him, the reading of personality, the cultivation of trust across cultural boundaries, the ability to operate in spaces where official channels could not reach, these were not skills that transferred easily to successors or translated into management textbooks. They were personal capacities, developed through experience and exercised through relationships that could not be inherited. The Purchase estate remained his primary residence through these years, though the property now served different purposes than it had during his decades of active leadership. The gatherings that had once brought together Soviet trade officials and American politicians, that had hosted conversations carrying implications for international commerce, gave way to quieter occasions, family events, visits from old colleagues, the rituals of a life entering its final movement. The grounds required maintenance, the house required staff, and Kendall retained the resources to provide both. But the sense of consequence that had once animated the property had diminished, its rooms now containers for memory rather than stages for action. His health remained reasonably stable into his 90s, a longevity that testified to either genetic fortune or the careful management of physical resources that characterized his approach to all matters. He continued to travel, to maintain connections with the diminishing circle of contemporaries who remained alive, to follow the developments in global commerce that had consumed his professional life. PepsiCo acknowledged his legacy through the naming of a sculpture garden at the company's headquarters. The Donald M. Kendall Sculpture Gardens, 45 acres of grounds, featuring works by major 20th century artists. The honor was genuine, but also valedictory, the kind of recognition that institutions offer when active contribution has ceased. The North Carolina properties eventually passed out of his direct control, though the precise timing and circumstances of these transitions remained private matters, handled through attorneys and family offices without public announcement. The purposes these retreats had served belonged to a specific historical moment, a time when back-channel diplomacy required physical distance from observation, when the cultivation of relationships demanded extended hospitality in settings removed from professional scrutiny. That moment had passed. The world that emerged after the Cold War conducted its negotiations through different means, in different spaces, leaving the estates that had once hosted quiet, consequential gatherings to find new functions or new owners. What Kendall thought of the world that his efforts had helped create remained unrecorded in any substantial form. He had not written a memoir, had not authorized a biography that might have explored the fuller dimensions of his career. The official accounts remained official, a businessman who had seen opportunities in engagement, who had built a company into a global presence, who had maintained friendships with powerful men across decades of upheaval. The final years passed in the manner that great age imposes, a gradual contraction of radius, a narrowing of the world to what could be managed within diminishing energy. Kendall remained at the Purchase estate, surrounded by the accumulations of a life lived at considerable scale. The art he had collected, the furnishings selected across decades of travel, the photographs that documented encounters with figures whose names had once commanded attention in global capitals, these objects persisted, holding their meanings for those who could still read them. Visitors who saw him in these years found a man whose mental clarity had survived longer than might have been expected, though the physical frame had yielded to time's inevitable work. He could speak of Moscow in 1959 with precision, could recall the texture of conversations that had shaped commercial history. Whether he dwelt on these memories in private, whether he measured his achievements against some internal standard of success or failure, remained unknown. He had never been given to public introspection, and age did not alter this disposition. The world beyond the estate's boundaries had continued its transformations. Russia, the country he had done more than perhaps any other American businessman to open to Western commerce, had evolved through stages he had not anticipated. The chaos of the Yeltsin years, the consolidation under Putin, the return of tensions that echoed the Cold War he had worked to transcend through trade. PepsiCo's position in that market had shifted through competitive pressures and political complications, the early advantage long since dissolved into a more contested landscape. The bridges he had built remained standing, but the traffic across them moved according to logics he no longer influenced. On September 19, 2020, the end arrived. The obituaries appeared in the expected publications, offering the expected narratives. A titan of American business, a Cold War diplomat of the corporate world, the man who had handed Khrushchev a Pepsi, who had opened the Soviet Union to American commerce, who had maintained loyalty to Richard Nixon when others had fled. The accounts were accurate in their facts and incomplete in their implications, as such accounts inevitably are. They described a life of achievement without fully capturing the texture of how that achievement had been accomplished. The private meetings, the careful cultivation of trust, the operations conducted in spaces that left no documentation. The Purchase estate passed to survivors whose names did not appear in business publications. The sculpture gardens at PepsiCo headquarters remained, 45 acres of art and landscape bearing his name.